Driving home alone on a stormy night was never something I enjoyed, but sometimes it couldn't be avoided. The rain was coming down hard, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead of me. Lightning flashed in the distance, illuminating the road in brief, eerie bursts of light. As I navigated the winding country roads, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Glancing in my rearview mirror, I noticed a car following closely behind me, its headlights glaring in the darkness. At first, I thought nothing of it, perhaps they were just trying to get home like me. But as the miles passed, I realized that the driver behind me was driving recklessly, swerving in and out of lanes and tailgating me so closely that I could almost feel their breath on my neck. My heart began to race as I realized that they weren't just driving aggressively, they were trying to cause me harm. I tried to shake them off, speeding up and slowing down in an attempt to lose them, but they stayed right on my tail, their headlights looming ominously in my rearview mirror. Panic began to set in as I realized that I was completely alone on the deserted road, with no one around to help me if things went south. As the rain pelts down harder, I struggled to maintain control of my car, the tires slipping and sliding on the wet pavement. Lightning flashes overhead, casting eerie shadows on the road ahead. I can feel the fear gnawing at my stomach as I realize that I'm in real danger. Desperate for help, I reach for my phone, intending to call the police, but my hands are shaking so badly that I can barely hold onto it. I glance in my rearview mirror again, only to see the car behind me closing in fast, its headlights blinding me in the darkness. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realize that I have to think fast if I want to get out of this alive. I glance around for any sign of civilization, but all I see is endless fields stretching out into the distance, shrouded in darkness and rain. Suddenly, I spot a turnoff up ahead, a narrow dirt road leading off into the trees. With no other options left, I veer off the main road and onto the dirt track, praying that it will lead me to safety. The car behind me follows suit, its headlights casting long shadows on the trees as it pursues me down the narrow road. I can hear the sound of branches scraping against the side of my car as I speed through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I don't know how much longer I can keep this up, but I refuse to give up without a fight. I press down on the accelerator, pushing my car to its limits as I race through the night, the rain pounding down on the windshield like 1,000 tiny fists. Suddenly, I see lights up ahead, a small farmhouse nestled in the trees, its windows glowing warmly in the darkness. With a surge of relief, I realize that help is finally within reach. I pull into the driveway and leap out of my car, running towards the farmhouse as fast as my legs will carry me. Behind me, I can hear the sound of tires screeching on the gravel as the car behind me comes to a stop. As I reach the safety of the farmhouse, I pound on the door, screaming for help at the top of my lungs. Moments later, the door swings open, and a kindly-looking older couple peers out at me, concern written all over their faces. I try to explain what happened, but my words come out in a jumbled mess, the fear and adrenaline still coursing through my veins. The couple ushers me inside, offering me a warm blanket and a hot cup of tea as they listen to my story. They tell me that they'll call the police and get me some help, and I collapse onto the couch, trembling with relief. As I sip my tea and wait for the authorities to arrive, I can't help but wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found this farmhouse when I did. But one thing's for certain, I'll never forget the terror of that stormy night, or the feeling of being hunted by someone who wanted to do me harm. Working late at the office was nothing new for me. As a middle-aged man trying to climb the corporate ladder, I often found myself burning the midnight oil to meet deadlines and stay ahead of the competition. Tonight was no different, except for the storm raging outside. The rain pounded against the windows, accompanied by the occasional rumble of thunder. Despite the weather, I was determined to finish my work and head home. But as I packed up my belongings and made my way to the exit, I realized something was wrong. The doors were locked from the outside, trapping me inside the building. Panic began to rise in my chest as I frantically tried to open them, but they wouldn't budge. It was as if someone had deliberately locked me in. I checked my phone for a signal, hoping to call for help, but there was no service. I was completely cut off from the outside world, alone in the darkness with no way out. As I stood there, trying to come to terms with my situation, I heard footsteps echoing down the hallway. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that I wasn't alone in the building. Someone else was here with me, and they shouldn't be. I tried to stay calm as I listened to the sound of the footsteps growing closer, but fear gripped me like a vice. I knew I had to hide, to find somewhere to wait until help arrived, but there was nowhere to go. With no other options left, I ducked into an empty office and closed the door behind me, praying that whoever was out there wouldn't find me. I crouched down behind a desk, my heart pounding in my chest as I waited for the inevitable. Minutes passed like hours as I listened to the sound of footsteps getting closer and closer. I held my breath, willing myself to remain silent as the door to the office creaked open. I peeked out from behind the desk, my eyes widening in horror as I saw a figure silhouetted in the doorway. It was a man, tall and imposing, his features obscured by the darkness. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear rooted me to the spot as the man stepped into the room and began to search for me. I held my breath, praying that he wouldn't find me, but luck was not on my side. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that I was trapped, alone in the darkness with someone who shouldn't be there. I had to think fast if I wanted to survive. As the man drew closer, I scanned the room for anything I could use as a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy paperweight on the desk, and I grabbed it tightly in my hand, ready to defend myself if necessary. With a surge of adrenaline, I sprang out from behind the desk and confronted the man, brandishing the paperweight like a weapon. He looked surprised for a moment, as if he hadn't expected me to fight back, but then his expression hardened into a mask of rage. We struggled, grappling with each other in the darkness as the storm raged outside. I could feel the man's strength overpowering me, his hands closing around my throat as he tried to choke the life out of me. But I refused to give up without a fight. With all the strength I could muster, I swung the paperweight at his head, striking him with all the force I could muster. He stumbled backwards, stunned for a moment, and I seized the opportunity to make my escape. I ran as fast as my legs would carry me, tearing down the hallway and out into the stormy night. The rain soaked through my clothes, plastering my hair to my scalp as I sprinted towards the safety of the outside world. I didn't stop running until I reached the nearest police station, where I collapsed on the doorstep, gasping for breath and shaking with fear. It took me hours to calm down enough to tell the officers what had happened, but when I finally did, they sprang into action, launching a search for the man who had trapped me inside the building. In the end, they never found him, and I was left to wonder who he was and what he had wanted with me. Being alone at home during a thunderstorm was nothing new for me. As a teenage boy, I often found myself in this situation when my parents were out for the evening. Usually, I didn't mind it much. I just spent my time playing video games or watching TV until they got back. But tonight was different. As the storm raged outside, the sound of thunder echoed through the house, and the rain pounded against the windows. I was sitting in the living room, engrossed in a game, when I first heard a faint rustling noise coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind blowing through the trees or the rain hitting against the roof. But then I heard something else, footsteps, slow and deliberate, crunching against the gravel driveway. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any more sounds. But the only thing I could hear was the steady drumming of the rain and the occasional clap of thunder in the distance. I tried to brush it off as just my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that someone or something was lurking outside in the darkness. I debated whether to call the police, but a part of me didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was just a stray animal or a neighbor out for a late-night walk. I decided to wait and see if the noises stopped on their own. But they didn't. In fact, they only seemed to grow louder and more persistent as the night wore on. I could hear the sound of someone moving around outside, their footsteps getting closer and closer to the house. Fear began to gnaw at my insides as I realized that someone was trying to break in. I knew I had to do something, but I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do next. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone and dialed 911, my heart racing as I waited for someone to answer. When they did, I blurted out my address and told them what was happening, my voice shaking with fear. The operator assured me that help was on the way and told me to stay on the line until the police arrived. I clutched the phone tightly to my ear, my eyes darting around the room as I waited for the sound of sirens in the distance. But as the minutes ticked by, the noises outside only seemed to grow louder and more frantic. I could hear the sound of someone trying to force their way through the front door, their grunts and curses echoing through the house. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was completely defenseless, trapped inside with whoever was trying to break in. I considered trying to escape out the back door or through a window, but the thought of coming face to face with the intruder filled me with terror. I huddled in the corner of the living room, my heart pounding in my chest as I listened to the sound of the door being battered down. I prayed that the police would arrive soon, that they would burst through the door and save me from whatever was waiting on the other side. And then, suddenly, the noises stopped. The house fell silent, the only sound the steady drumming of the rain against the windows. I strained to listen for any sign of movement outside, but there was nothing. I held my breath, waiting for what felt like an eternity until finally, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Relief washed over me as I realized that help was finally on the way. Minutes later, the police arrived, their lights flashing as they pulled up outside the house. I stumbled out the front door, my legs weak with relief as I saw them approaching. I told them everything that had happened, from the strange noises I had heard to the attempted break-in. They took my statement and assured me that they would do everything in their power to catch whoever was responsible. As I watched them combing the area for clues, I couldn't help but feel a sense of gratitude that I had escaped unharmed. It was just a typical day at the office, with the usual hustle and bustle of coworkers going about their tasks. We were a close-knit group, working together day in and day out, but little did we know that our bond would soon be put to the test in the most terrifying way possible. As the afternoon wore on, dark clouds began to gather on the horizon, signaling an approaching storm. We watched uneasily as lightning streaked across the sky and thunder rumbled ominously in the distance. Then, without warning, the lights flickered and died, plunging the office into darkness. I could hear the panicked murmurs of my coworkers as we stumbled around in the blackness, trying to find our way to safety. As we made our way to the elevators, I could feel the tension in the air thickening with each passing moment. We crowded into the cramped space, eager to escape the chaos unfolding outside. But just as the doors began to close, there was a sudden jolt, and the elevator lurched to a stop. We were trapped, stranded between floors with no way out and no idea when help would arrive. At first, we tried to stay calm, reassuring each other that help would come soon and that everything would be okay. But as the minutes turned into hours, our patience began to wear thin, and tension started to rise. Tempers flared as accusations flew back and forth, each of us searching for someone to blame for our predicament. I could feel the fear and frustration mounting with each passing moment, threatening to boil over into outright chaos. And then, just when it seemed like things couldn't get any worse, we heard a voice that didn't belong to any of us. It was low and menacing, filled with malice and intent. We looked around in confusion, trying to pinpoint the source of the voice, but there was no one there. It was as if the words themselves had materialized out of thin air, haunting us with their chilling presence. As the voice continued to taunt us, I felt a sense of unease creeping over me. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that one of us was hiding something, that they knew more than they were letting on. But before we could confront the source of the voice, there was another jolt, and the elevator lurched back to life. With a collective sigh of relief, we stumbled out into the hallway, shaken but alive. As we made our way back to the office, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that our ordeal in the elevator had exposed a darkness lurking within our midst. My parents had gone out for the evening, leaving me in charge of my younger sibling. We were used to being home alone, but something about the storm made me uneasy. As the night wore on, the storm grew worse, the thunder booming overhead and the lightning flashing ominously in the sky. I tried to distract my sibling with games and movies, but the power went out, plunging the house into darkness. We huddled together in the living room, the only source of light coming from the flickering candles scattered around the room. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as strange noises echoed through the house. At first, I tried to dismiss the sounds as just the house settling or the wind rattling the windows. But as the noises grew louder and more persistent, I knew that something was terribly wrong. I grabbed a flashlight and ventured into the hallway, my senses on high alert as I listened for any sign of danger. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and I could feel the weight of the darkness pressing down on me like a suffocating blanket. Then, just as I was about to turn back, I heard the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs. My blood ran cold, and a sense of dread washed over me as I realized that we were now alone in the house. I rushed back to the living room, my heart racing as I tried to think of a plan. I knew that I had to protect my sibling at all costs, but I had no idea who or what was lurking in the shadows. As the minutes ticked by, the sounds grew closer and closer, until they were right outside the door. I could hear the muffled voices of strangers whispering to each other, their words filled with malice and intent. I grabbed my sibling's hand and pulled them behind me, trying to shield them from whatever was waiting on the other side of the door. I prayed silently for help, hoping that someone would come to our rescue before it was too late. But no one came. The minutes stretched into hours, and still, we were alone in the darkness with our fears and our prayers. Then, just as I was about to lose hope, I heard the sound of sirens in the distance. Help had finally arrived, and I breathed a sigh of relief as I watched the flashing lights draw closer and closer. The police burst through the door, their guns drawn as they swept through the house, searching for the intruders. I watched in horror as they emerged from the darkness, their faces twisted in anger and frustration. But as the police led them away in handcuffs, I felt a sense of triumph wash over me. We had survived the night, and I knew that we would emerge from this ordeal stronger than ever before. As the storm raged on outside, I held my sibling close, grateful for their safety and determined to protect them from any harm that might come their way. It was a dark and stormy night, the kind that sends shivers down your spine and makes you wish you were anywhere but out on the road. I was a delivery driver, making my rounds through the remote countryside, when the storm hit with full force, knocking out the power and leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I tried to navigate the winding roads, but the rain was coming down in sheets, and visibility was next to nothing. Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating the trees and the road ahead in brief, stark bursts. Just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, I heard a loud pop and felt the car lurch to a halt. I cursed under my breath as I realized that I had a flat tire, and I pulled over to the side of the road to assess the damage. With no other option, I grabbed my flashlight and ventured out into the storm, hoping to find shelter until the worst of it passed. That's when I spotted it, a dilapidated old house looming in the distance, its windows shattered and its roof sagging under the weight of the rain. I hesitated for a moment, my instinct screaming at me to turn back and find another way, but the storm was getting worse by the minute, and I knew that I didn't have much time. As I approached the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The air was heavy with the scent of mildew and decay, and a sense of foreboding hung in the air like a thick fog. I stepped inside cautiously, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms as I searched for any sign of life. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the wind howled outside like a mournful wail. That's when I heard it, the sound of voices coming from the shadows. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any more sounds. At first, I thought it might just be the wind playing tricks on me, but as the voices grew louder and more distinct, I realized that I was now alone in the house. I followed the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand as I crept through the darkness. The voices led me to the basement, where I found two men huddled together in the corner, their faces hidden in the shadows. I tried to make out their features, but the darkness was too thick, and I couldn't see more than vague outlines in the dim light. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking with fear. "Is anyone there?" The men turned to look at me, their eyes gleaming in the darkness like those of predators on the hunt. I could feel their gaze boring into me, cold and calculating, and a shiver ran down my spine. I knew then that I had stumbled upon something sinister, something that I was not meant to see. But before I could turn and run, one of the men stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "We've been waiting for you," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Welcome to our home." I tried to back away, but the other man moved to block my escape, his eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I knew then that I was in real danger, that these men meant me harm. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the darkness. Behind me, I could hear the men giving chase, their footsteps echoing through the empty halls as they pursued me relentlessly. I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever had before, but it was no use. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I spotted a light in the distance, a farmhouse on the edge of the road. With one final burst of energy, I sprinted towards it, praying that whoever lived there would help me. As I reached the farmhouse, I pounded on the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I begged for help. To my relief, the door swung open, and a kind-faced farmer ushered me inside, his expression filled with concern. I tried to explain what had happened, but my words came out in a jumble of fear and panic. The farmer listened patiently, his brow furrowed in thought as he considered my story. After a moment, he nodded gravely and told me that I was lucky to have escaped, that the men I had encountered were dangerous and not to be trifled with. I thanked him profusely for his help, and he offered to drive me back to town in the morning once the storm had passed. I accepted gratefully, knowing that I would never forget the terrifying encounter that had unfolded on that remote road in the middle of the night. It was one of those stormy nights when the rain poured down like it had a grudge against the earth. I had been holed up in the library, trying to cram for an upcoming exam, when I noticed something strange out of the corner of my eye. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a shadow dancing in the flickering glow of the fluorescent bulbs. But when I turned to look, I saw a figure lurking in the shadows, its eyes fixed on me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to shake off the feeling of unease that washed over me, telling myself that it was just my imagination getting the best of me. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right. I gathered my things and made my way to the door, eager to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the library and get back to the safety of my dorm room. But when I tried to open the door, I found it locked tight, the metal handle refusing to budge no matter how hard I pulled. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was trapped, alone in the library with whoever or whatever was lurking in the shadows. I pounded on the door, calling out for help, but my cries were swallowed up by the roar of the storm outside. I glanced back over my shoulder and saw the figure moving closer, its movements slow and deliberate as it emerged from the darkness. I could feel its eyes on me, watching my every move with a predatory gleam that made my blood run cold. I knew then that I was in real danger, that whoever was out there meant me harm. With a surge of adrenaline, I turned and ran, my heart pounding in my chest as I raced through the aisles of books, searching for a way out. But no matter which way I turned, I found myself face to face with locked doors and dead ends. It was as if the library itself was conspiring against me, trapping me in its maze-like corridors with no way out. I could hear the figure getting closer, its footsteps echoing through the empty halls as it pursued me relentlessly. I pushed myself harder, running faster than I ever had before, but it was no use. Just when I thought I couldn't go on, I spotted a staircase leading down to the basement. With no other options left, I descended into the darkness, hoping to find some way to escape the horror that was chasing me. The basement was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of my phone screen. I stumbled through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for a way out. That's when I heard it, the sound of heavy breathing coming from somewhere in the darkness. I froze in place, my blood turning to ice as I listened intently for any more sounds. But all I could hear was the pounding of my own heart, the rhythm of fear echoing through the empty space. I knew then that I was now alone down there, that whatever was lurking in the shadows was waiting for me to make a move. With a trembling hand, I raised my phone and cast its feeble light into the darkness. And what I saw sent a shiver down my spine. There, standing in the corner of the basement, was the figure from the library, its eyes fixed on me with a hunger that made my stomach churn. I could see now that it was no ordinary person, but something else entirely, something twisted and malevolent, with an insatiable thirst for blood. I wanted to scream, to run, but fear rooted me to the spot as I watched the figure draw closer, its movements slow and deliberate as it closed the distance between us. And then, just as it was about to reach out and grab me, I heard the sound of keys jangling in the distance. I turned and saw the librarian emerging from the shadows, a look of concern on her face as she rushed to unlock the door. I stumbled towards her, my legs trembling with exhaustion as I collapsed into her arms. She held me close, murmuring words of comfort as she led me out of the basement and into the safety of the stormy night. As we emerged into the cool night air, I felt a sense of relief wash over me, knowing that I had escaped the horror that had been lurking in the shadows. We had been driving for hours, hoping to reach our destination before the storm hit, but fate had other plans. As we rounded a bend in the road, our car sputtered and died, leaving us stranded in the pouring rain with no sign of help in sight. Panic surged through me as I realized that we were alone, at the mercy of the elements and whoever or whatever might be lurking in the darkness. We huddled together in the car, trying to stay warm as the wind howled outside and the rain drummed against the windows like 1,000 tiny fingers. I could feel the tension mounting as we waited for help to arrive, each passing minute feeling like an eternity. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, we heard it, the distant rumble of an engine coming down the road. Relief washed over me as I realized that help was finally on the way, but that relief quickly turned to dread as the headlights grew closer and I saw the silhouette of a truck looming in the darkness. I watched in horror as the truck pulled up beside us, its engine idling ominously as the driver rolled down the window and peered out at us with cold, calculating eyes. There was something about him that set my teeth on edge, something sinister lurking behind his friendly smile and outstretched hand. He offered to help us, to give us a lift to the nearest town where we could find a mechanic and get our car fixed. But there was something about the way he spoke, something off about the gleam in his eye that made my skin crawl. I wanted to refuse his offer, to trust my instincts and wait for help to arrive, but desperation clouded my judgment and I found myself nodding along with the others, eager to escape the storm and get back on the road. As we climbed into the back of the truck, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were making a terrible mistake, that we were walking straight into the lion's den with no way out. But it was too late to turn back now, and so we pressed on, our hearts pounding in our chests as the truck rumbled down the deserted road. The driver was silent as he navigated the winding roads, his eyes fixed on the road ahead as if he were in a trance. I tried to strike up a conversation, to break the tension that hung in the air like a thick fog, but he brushed me off with a curt nod and a forced smile. It wasn't long before I realized that something was seriously wrong, that we were not headed towards the nearest town as the driver had promised, but deeper into the heart of the storm, away from civilization and any hope of rescue. Panic surged through me as I realized that we were in real danger, that the driver had no intention of helping us and that we were at his mercy. I turned to the others, my voice trembling as I urged them to do something, anything, to escape. But it was too late. The driver had locked the doors from the inside, trapping us in the back of the truck with no way out. I pounded on the windows, screaming for help, but my cries were drowned out by the roar of the storm and the rumble of the engine. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, we saw it, a glimmer of light in the distance, the faint outline of a building looming out of the darkness like a beacon of hope in the night. With a surge of adrenaline, we threw ourselves against the doors, pushing and pulling with all our might until finally, they gave way with a deafening crash. We stumbled out into the storm, gasping for breath as we ran towards the safety of the building, our hearts pounding in our chests as we prayed that help would arrive in time. As we reached the door, I glanced back over my shoulder and saw the truck disappearing into the night, its taillights fading into the distance like a fading memory. And in that moment, I knew that we had narrowly escaped a fate worse than death, that we had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the tale. It was a stormy night, the kind of night that sends chills down your spine and makes you question your sanity. My friends and I, being the adventurous bunch that we were, decided to explore the abandoned amusement park on the outskirts of town. It was a place we had heard stories about, rumors of strange happenings and eerie encounters that had sent shivers down our spines. As we made our way through the crumbling entrance gate, the wind howled and the rain pounded against the ground, masking our footsteps as we ventured deeper into the park. The air was heavy with the scent of decay and rust, and a sense of unease settled over us like a thick fog. We split up into groups, each of us eager to explore the decaying rides and attractions that lay scattered throughout the park. But as we wandered deeper into the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that someone or something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. I tried to brush off my fears and focus on the thrill of exploration, but with each passing moment, the feeling of dread only grew stronger. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the echoes of distant laughter and screams, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As we made our way through the abandoned rides and attractions, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was following us, lurking just out of sight in the darkness. I glanced nervously over my shoulder, but all I saw was the empty expanse of the park stretching out behind us, shrouded in darkness and mystery. But then, just as I was about to dismiss my fears as just the product of an overactive imagination, I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the night, slow and deliberate, like the footsteps of a predator stalking its prey. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any more sounds. My friends called out to me, their voices tinged with concern, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the darkness that surrounded us, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking out there in the night. And then, suddenly, the darkness shifted, and I saw it, a figure lurking in the shadows, its eyes gleaming with malice as it watched us from afar. I tried to scream, to warn my friends of the danger that lurked nearby, but no sound escaped my lips as the figure advanced towards us, its movements slow and deliberate. Panic surged through me as I realized that we were not alone, that someone or something was hunting us down in the darkness. I turned to run, to flee from the danger that lurked in the shadows, but it was too late. The figure was upon us, its hands reaching out to grab us and drag us into the depths of the night. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, a blinding light pierced the darkness, illuminating the figure and sending it recoiling in fear. I shielded my eyes against the glare, my heart pounding in my chest as I struggled to make sense of what was happening. And then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure vanished into the darkness, leaving us alone in the silence of the night. We stumbled out of the park, shaken but alive, our minds reeling with thoughts of the terror that we had narrowly escaped. I was home alone, my roommate out of town for the weekend, leaving me to fend for myself in the midst of the raging storm. As I sat on the couch, watching the rain lash against the windows, my phone buzzed with a new message. I glanced at the screen, expecting to see a text from a friend or family member checking in on me. But instead, I saw a message from an unknown number, the words ominous and threatening. My heart pounded in my chest as I read the message, my hands trembling as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Who could be sending me such terrifying messages, and why? I tried to brush off the message as just a prank or a wrong number, but deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that settled over me like a dark cloud. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. As the storm raged on outside, the power flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Panic surged through me as I fumbled for my phone, the only source of light in the pitch-black room. But as I turned on the flashlight and cast its feeble glow around the room, I realized that I was not alone. I could feel eyes on me, watching my every move from the darkness, and I knew that I had to find a way out before it was too late. I tried to call for help, to reach out to someone, anyone, who could come to my aid. But the storm had knocked out the phone lines, leaving me stranded and helpless in the darkness. Desperation gnawed at my insides as I searched for a way out, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to ignore the feeling of dread that washed over me like a tidal wave. I knew that I had to find a way to escape, to get out of this nightmare before it consumed me whole. I stumbled through the darkness, my footsteps echoing off the walls as I searched for a way out. But every door I tried was locked tight, trapping me inside with whatever lurked in the shadows. And then, just as all hope seemed lost, I heard a noise, a soft, sinister sound that sent shivers down my spine. I froze in place, my breath catching in my throat as I strained to listen for any more sounds. But the noise came again, closer this time, and I knew that I had to act fast if I wanted to survive. With trembling hands, I reached for the nearest weapon, a heavy candlestick that sat on the mantel, and held it tightly in my grasp. As the footsteps drew nearer, I braced myself for whatever horror awaited me in the darkness. But just as the figure stepped into the feeble light of my flashlight, I saw a glimmer of recognition in their eyes, a glimmer of humanity that sent a wave of relief coursing through my veins. It was my neighbor, their face twisted in fear and confusion as they stumbled towards me. They had heard my cries for help and had come to investigate, their own home plunged into darkness by the storm. Together, we managed to find our way out of the house and into the safety of the stormy night. As we huddled together outside, the rain pounding down around us, I couldn't help but feel grateful for their presence, their bravery in the face of danger. We were just a group of friends, eager for adventure and the thrill of exploring the great outdoors. We had planned a weekend hiking trip in the mountains, hoping to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. But as we set out on our journey, we couldn't have anticipated the terror that awaited us in the darkness of the night. The storm rolled in quickly, swallowing up the trail in a thick blanket of fog and rain, obscuring our path and leaving us disoriented and lost. At first, we tried to remain calm, reassuring each other that we would find our way back to civilization soon. But as the hours passed and the storm showed no signs of letting up, panic began to set in. We stumbled through the darkness, our flashlights casting feeble beams of light that barely pierced the thick fog. The wind howled around us, carrying with it the distant sound of wolves howling in the night. I felt a shiver run down my spine as I listened to the eerie chorus of howls, their voices echoing off the mountainside with a haunting intensity. I knew that wolves were common in these parts, but something about the way they sounded sent a chill down my spine. As we pressed on, the feeling of being watched grew stronger, like unseen eyes were following our every move from the shadows. I tried to shake off the feeling, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild in the darkness. But then we heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the trees, slow and deliberate, like someone or something was stalking us from the shadows. My heart pounded in my chest as I listened intently, straining to catch any more sounds that might betray our unseen pursuer. We quickened our pace, hoping to outpace whatever was following us in the darkness. But no matter how fast we ran, the footsteps seemed to keep pace with us, drawing closer and closer with each passing moment. As we reached a clearing in the forest, the full moon broke through the clouds, casting an eerie glow over the landscape. And that's when we saw them, two pairs of glowing eyes staring back at us from the darkness, their gaze filled with a predatory hunger that sent a wave of fear coursing through my veins. We froze in place, our hearts pounding in our chests as we stared back at the wolves, their sleek, black fur blending seamlessly into the night. I knew that we were no match for them in a fight, that our only chance of survival was to outsmart them and find a way to escape. But as we turned to flee, we realized that we were surrounded on all sides, trapped in a circle of hungry predators with nowhere to run. Panic surged through me as I searched desperately for an escape route, but every path seemed blocked by the snarling wolves. We were at their mercy, our fate hanging in the balance as they closed in on us with bared teeth and growling snarls. I felt a sense of helplessness wash over me, knowing that there was nothing we could do to save ourselves from the jaws of the creatures that hunted us in the night. But just as all hope seemed lost, a flash of inspiration struck me, and I remembered the old legends of the mountains, the stories of the wolves that were said to possess a strange intelligence and cunning. With a surge of adrenaline, I called out to my friends, urging them to stand their ground and hold off the wolves while I searched for a way out. They nodded in understanding, their faces grim with determination as they prepared to face the creatures head-on. I took off running, my heart pounding in my chest as I searched for a path through the trees. And then, just when I thought all was lost, I spotted it, a narrow ravine hidden in the shadows, too narrow for the wolves to follow. With a sense of relief flooding through me, I called out to my friends, guiding them towards the safety of the ravine. And as we huddled together in the darkness, listening to the sounds of the wolves fading into the distance, I knew that we had escaped the clutches of death. It was a typical stormy night, rain lashing against the windows, wind howling through the trees. Inside, my family and I were huddled together in the living room, enjoying a cozy movie night. The sound of laughter and the glow of the TV provided a sense of warmth and comfort, despite the fierce weather raging outside. But little did we know, our peaceful evening was about to take a terrifying turn. Suddenly, there came a loud knocking at the door, sharp and urgent against the backdrop of the storm. We exchanged puzzled glances, wondering who could be out in such weather. My father rose from his seat, a look of concern crossing his face as he made his way to the door. He hesitated for a moment, casting a wary glance back at us before pulling it open. Standing on the doorstep was a man, his face obscured by the darkness and the rain. He seemed out of breath, as if he had been running, and there was a wild look in his eyes that sent a shiver down my spine. He claimed that his car had broken down and that he needed to use our phone to call for help. My father, ever the kind-hearted soul, offered to lend him a hand, despite the nagging feeling of unease that hung in the air. As the man stepped inside, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about him. There was an air of menace that seemed to radiate from his very being, and I found myself inching closer to my family, seeking comfort in their presence. But before anyone could react, the man's demeanor suddenly changed. His eyes narrowed, and a sinister smile spread across his face as he turned to face us. It was then that we realized the truth. This man was not here for help. He had come with bad intentions, and now we were trapped with nowhere to run. Panic surged through me as I realized the danger we were in. I looked to my father, hoping for some sign of reassurance, but his expression mirrored my own fear and uncertainty. The man's voice cut through the silence like a knife, low and menacing as he outlined his demands. He wanted money, valuables, anything he could get his hands on. And he made it clear that he wouldn't hesitate to use force if necessary. As he spoke, I could feel the weight of his words pressing down on me, suffocating me with a sense of dread and helplessness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I struggled to keep my breathing steady as fear threatened to overwhelm me. But even in the face of danger, my family refused to back down. We stood our ground, united in our determination to protect each other at all costs. As the standoff continued, the tension in the room became palpable, thick enough to choke on. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind rattling the windows, seemed to herald the approach of disaster. And then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, there came a sudden commotion from outside. We rushed to the window, our hearts pounding in our chests as we peered out into the darkness. To our relief, we saw the flashing lights of a police car approaching, followed closely by the sound of sirens wailing in the distance. The man's expression darkened as he realized that his time was up. With a curse, he made a run for the door, but my father was quick to intercept him, pinning him to the ground until the police arrived to take him into custody. As the adrenaline began to fade and the reality of what had just happened sunk in, my family and I huddled together, grateful to be alive. Despite the terror we had endured, we emerged from the ordeal stronger and more united than ever before. And as the storm continued to rage outside, I couldn't help but feel a sense of relief knowing that we had faced our darkest fears and come out the other side battered, but unbroken. My wife and I were at home with our newborn baby, trying to keep her calm amidst the howling wind and pounding rain. But as the hours passed, our daughter's cries grew louder and more insistent, a heartbreaking wail that seemed to echo through the house. I glanced at my wife, a look of desperation in my eyes as I realized we had run out of formula. Without hesitation, I made the decision to brave the storm and drive to the store for more. My wife pleaded with me to stay, her voice trembling with fear, but I knew I had to do whatever it took to provide for our daughter. I bundled up in my coat and grabbed the car keys, steeling myself for the journey ahead. The wind whipped around me as I stepped outside, the rain soaking through my clothes in seconds. I hesitated for a moment, the gravity of the situation sinking in as I realized the danger I was putting myself in. But the thought of my daughter hungry and crying was enough to push me forward, despite the fear gnawing at the pit of my stomach. I climbed into the car and started the engine, the roar of the storm drowning out all other sound. The rain pounded against the windshield, obscuring my view of the road ahead as I navigated the treacherous streets. The journey to the store felt like an eternity, each passing moment filled with a sense of dread and anticipation. I gripped the steering wheel tightly, my knuckles turning white as I fought to keep control of the car in the driving rain. But just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw the glow of the store's lights up ahead, a beacon of hope in the darkness. I breathed a sigh of relief, my heart pounding in my chest as I pulled into the parking lot. I rushed inside, my clothes dripping with rain as I made my way to the baby aisle. But as I reached for a bottle of formula, I heard a voice behind me, a low, menacing whisper that sent a chill down my spine. I turned to see a figure standing in the shadows, their face obscured by the darkness. My pulse quickened as I realized I was now alone, that someone or something was watching me with malevolent intent. I tried to brush off the feeling of unease, to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong, that I was in danger. I grabbed the formula and hurried to the checkout, my hands trembling as I fumbled with my wallet. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw the figure moving closer, their footsteps echoing through the empty store. Panic surged through me as I realized that I was being followed, that this person had sinister intentions. I sprinted to the door, my heart pounding in my chest as I burst out into the stormy night. I raced to my car, fumbling with the keys as I struggled to unlock the door. But just as I was about to climb inside, I felt a hand on my shoulder, a cold, clammy grip that sent a shiver down my spine. I spun around to confront my assailant, but there was no one there. The parking lot was empty, save for the howling wind and driving rain. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that clung to me like a second skin. But as I climbed into the car and peeled out of the parking lot, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was still out there, lurking in the darkness. I drove home as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest as I prayed that I would make it back to my wife and daughter safely. But as I pulled into the driveway, a sense of relief washed over me. I had made it home in one piece. I rushed inside, the sound of my daughter's cries echoing through the house. My wife was waiting for me, her eyes filled with relief as she took the formula from my trembling hands. We fed our daughter together, the tension of the night slowly melting away as we held her close. But as I looked out the window at the storm raging outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had narrowly escaped a fate far worse than anything we could have imagined. The storm raged outside my beachfront cottage, the wind howling and the rain lashing against the windows like a relentless force of nature. I was alone, as I usually was, the sound of the storm the only company I had. But then, there was a knock at the door. I hesitated for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest as I wondered who could be out there in the middle of the night, in the midst of such a fierce storm. But the knocking persisted, growing louder and more urgent with each passing moment. With a sense of unease gnawing at the pit of my stomach, I made my way to the door and peered through the peephole. There, standing on my doorstep, was a figure shrouded in darkness, their face obscured by the driving rain. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do. But then, the figure spoke, a voice filled with desperation and fear, pleading for help. They claimed that someone was in trouble out at sea, that they needed assistance right away. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and rushed outside, the wind whipping in my face as I made my way down to the beach. The rain poured down around me, soaking me to the bone as I scanned the dark, churning waters for any sign of distress. But as I reached the water's edge, I realized that something was wrong. There was no one out there, no sign of a struggling swimmer or a sinking boat. It was just me, alone in the darkness, with nothing but the roar of the storm for company. A sense of dread washed over me as I realized that I had been lured out here under false pretenses, that whoever had knocked on my door had led me into a trap. I turned to head back to the safety of my cottage, but before I could take a single step, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. I spun around to confront my attacker, but there was no one there. The beach was empty, save for the crashing waves and the howling wind. I shook my head, trying to shake off the feeling of fear that gripped me like a vice. But then, I heard it, a low, guttural growl, echoing through the darkness like a warning. My blood ran cold as I realized that I was now alone, that there was something out there in the storm with me, something dangerous and predatory. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But then, I saw it, a pair of glowing eyes, shining in the darkness like beacons of malevolence. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing through the sand as I fled back to the safety of my cottage. The wind whipped at my face, stinging my skin as I raced against the storm, desperate to escape whatever lurked out there in the darkness. I reached the cottage and slammed the door shut behind me, my heart hammering in my chest as I locked it tight. I leaned against the door, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to calm my racing thoughts. But then, I heard it, the sound of scratching at the door, like claws scraping against wood. My blood ran cold as I realized that whatever had been out there on the beach was now trying to force its way inside. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. I knew that I couldn't stay here, that I needed to get away before whatever was outside broke through and attacked. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone and dialed 911, my voice shaking as I told the operator what was happening. But as I waited for help to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was running out of time, that whatever was outside was getting closer with each passing moment. I glanced out the window and saw the figure standing on the beach, their eyes glowing in the darkness as they watched me with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I knew then that I was not dealing with a mere human, but something far more sinister and malevolent. And as I waited for help to arrive, I prayed that I would survive the night, that I would live to see another day and escape the terror that had descended upon me. The moments stretched on like an eternity as I waited for the authorities to arrive, my heart pounding in my chest with each passing second. I kept my eyes glued to the window, my breath catching in my throat every time I caught a glimpse of movement outside. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the sound of sirens pierced the night air, signaling the arrival of help. I let out a sigh of relief, my trembling hands reaching for the door as I prepared to let the rescuers inside. But as I reached for the handle, a sudden sense of dread washed over me. What if the figure on the beach was still out there, lurking in the darkness, waiting to attack? What if help wasn't coming at all, and I was left to face this nightmare alone? Despite my fear, I knew that I had no choice but to open the door and let the authorities in. With a deep breath, I turned the handle and swung the door open, my eyes scanning the darkness for any sign of danger. But to my relief, there was no one there. The beach was empty, save for the crashing waves and the driving rain. I let out a sigh of relief, my shoulders slumping with relief as I realized that I was finally safe. The authorities rushed inside, their flashlights cutting through the darkness as they searched the cottage for any sign of danger. But there was nothing to be found, no sign of the mysterious figure that had lured me out into the storm, no evidence of the terror that had gripped me for so long. As the storm began to subside outside, I felt a sense of calm wash over me. The nightmare was over, and I was finally safe. The rain lashed against the windows of the subway car as I sat, my mind drifting in a haze of exhaustion. It had been a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home and crawl into bed. But as the train rumbled to a stop at my station, I knew that my journey was far from over. I stepped out onto the platform, the storm raging outside as I made my way towards the exit. The wind howled through the station, sending shivers down my spine as I pulled my coat tighter around me. But as I reached the top of the stairs and stepped out into the open air, I knew that something was wrong. There, standing in the shadows, was a group of men, thugs, by the looks of them waiting for me. My heart skipped a beat as I realized what was happening. These men were here to rob me, to take everything I had and leave me with nothing. Fear gripped me like a vice as I tried to think of a way out of this situation. But before I could even react, the thugs were upon me, their faces twisted with malice as they demanded my possessions. I knew that I had no choice but to comply, that resisting would only make things worse. With trembling hands, I reached into my pockets and pulled out my wallet and phone, handing them over to the men without a word. They snatched them from my grasp, their laughter echoing in the empty street as they disappeared into the night. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to process what had just happened. I felt violated, vulnerable, as if the world had suddenly become a much darker and more dangerous place. But as the adrenaline began to fade, I knew that I had to keep moving, that I couldn't stay here in the open where I was vulnerable to further attacks. With a sense of dread weighing heavy on my shoulders, I began to make my way home, my footsteps echoing in the empty street as I hurried through the storm. The rain soaked through my clothes, chilling me to the bone as I trudged through the darkness. I felt exposed, as if every shadow held a potential threat, every sound a harbinger of danger. But as I turned the corner and saw the lights of my apartment building looming in the distance, a sense of relief washed over me. I was almost home, almost safe from the horrors that lurked in the night. I quickened my pace, eager to put this nightmare behind me and escape into the warmth and safety of my own home. But as I reached the front door and fumbled for my keys, I felt a sudden chill run down my spine. There, standing in the shadows, was a figure, a silhouette outlined against the darkness, watching me with cold, calculating eyes. My blood ran cold as I realized that the thugs had followed me, that they were here to finish what they had started. With a surge of adrenaline, I lunged for the door, my hands shaking as I struggled to get it open. But before I could even turn the key, I felt a sharp blow to the back of my head, sending me sprawling to the ground. Pain exploded behind my eyes as I struggled to push myself up, my vision swimming as I tried to make sense of what was happening. But before I could even gather my thoughts, I felt hands grabbing at me, pulling me back into the darkness. I screamed for help, but my voice was lost in the storm, drowned out by the howling wind and driving rain. I thrashed and fought, desperate to break free from the grip of my attackers, but it was no use. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I lay there on the ground, battered and bruised, as the thugs disappeared into the night, leaving me broken and alone. As I lay there in the darkness, the pain searing through my body, I knew that I was lucky to be alive. The night was dark and stormy as I settled into my shift as a security officer at the warehouse. It was just another routine night, or so I thought. The rain hammered against the windows, and the wind howled through the empty corridors, creating an eerie atmosphere that sent shivers down my spine. I patrolled the warehouse, my footsteps echoing in the empty halls as I checked each door and window, ensuring that everything was secure. But as I made my rounds, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that tonight was different somehow. And then, just as I was about to dismiss my unease as paranoia, I heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the warehouse. My heart skipped a beat as I strained to listen, trying to pinpoint the source of the noise. But the footsteps faded away as quickly as they had come, leaving me standing there in the darkness, my pulse racing with fear and uncertainty. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, but deep down, I knew that something was wrong. I continued my patrol, my senses on high alert as I scanned the shadows for any sign of movement. But try as I might, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that someone or something was lurking in the darkness, waiting to strike. As the night wore on, the storm grew fiercer, the rain drumming against the roof with a relentless fury. I huddled in my office, trying to stay warm and dry as I kept a vigilant watch over the warehouse. But then, just as I was beginning to relax, I heard the sound of breaking glass, followed by the clatter of footsteps on the concrete floor. My blood ran cold as I realized that the intruders had found their way inside. I sprang into action, rushing towards the source of the noise with adrenaline coursing through my veins. But as I rounded the corner, I came face to face with a team of masked men, their eyes gleaming with malice as they brandished weapons in my direction. I froze in place, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out of this nightmare. But before I could even react, the intruders were upon me, overpowering me with ease and pinning me to the ground. I struggled and fought, desperate to break free from their grip, but it was no use. The intruders were too strong, too well organized, and soon I found myself bound and gagged, helpless to resist as they ransacked the warehouse. I watched helplessly as they looted the shelves, their laughter echoing through the empty halls as they filled their bags with stolen goods. It was a chilling sight, a stark reminder of the fragility of security in the face of determined criminals. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the intruders were gone, disappearing into the night with their ill-gotten gains. I lay there on the floor, bruised and battered, as the realization sank in that I had failed in my duty to protect the warehouse. As the storm raged on outside, I knew that I would have to face the consequences of my failure, that I would have to explain to my superiors how I had let the intruders slip through my fingers. The night was pitch black as I drove my truck down the lonely stretch of highway, rain pounding against the windshield and lightning streaking across the sky. I was tired and eager to reach my destination, but little did I know, the night had other plans for me. As I rounded a bend in the road, I saw them, a group of figures standing in the middle of the highway, their faces obscured by the darkness. At first, I thought they were just stranded motorists seeking help, but as I got closer, I realized that something was off. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, filled with a sinister intensity that sent a chill down my spine. I tried to swerve around them, to avoid whatever trouble they were brewing, but it was too late. They surged forward, surrounding my truck with their bodies and blocking my path. Panic gripped me as I realized that I was trapped, at the mercy of these strangers who meant me harm. I reached for my phone, intending to call for help, but before I could even dial the number, the figures descended upon my truck, pounding on the windows and shouting threats. I frantically tried to start the engine and drive away, but the engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of the highway with no way out. I looked around desperately, searching for any means of escape, but the rain was coming down in sheets, obscuring my vision and leaving me disoriented and helpless. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, the figures began to rock my truck back and forth, their laughter echoing through the darkness as they reveled in my fear and desperation. I pounded on the steering wheel in frustration, my heart pounding in my chest as I realized that I was completely at their mercy, with no one around to help me. But just as I was about to give up hope, I heard the sound of approaching headlights, cutting through the darkness like a beacon of salvation. Relief washed over me as I saw the headlights draw nearer, illuminating the figures in stark relief. It was a passing car, coming to my rescue at just the right moment. The figures scattered like shadows in the night, disappearing into the darkness as the car pulled up beside my truck. The driver rolled down their window, their face illuminated by the soft glow of their headlights. They asked if I was okay, if I needed help, and I nodded gratefully, my voice catching in my throat as I tried to explain what had happened. But before I could say another word, the driver reached out and handed me a cell phone, telling me to call the police and report the incident. I thanked them profusely, my hands shaking as I dialed the number and waited for help to arrive. As I sat there in the darkness, waiting for the police to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped a brush with death. We were a team of scientists, huddled together in the dimly lit lab, working late into the night on our latest project. As the storm raged outside, casting eerie shadows across the room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The atmosphere was tense, charged with an undercurrent of fear and uncertainty. And then, just as I was about to brush off my unease as nothing more than paranoia, I heard the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, slow and deliberate. I froze in place, my heart pounding in my chest as I strained to listen for any more sounds. But the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving me in an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I exchanged nervous glances with my colleagues, our eyes wide with fear as we realized that we were now alone in the facility. Someone or something had breached our security measures and entered the building. With trembling hands, I reached for the phone, intending to call for help, but before I could even dial the number, the lights flickered and went out, plunging us into darkness. Panic gripped me as I fumbled for a flashlight, my hands shaking as I tried to find my way in the pitch-black darkness. But as I swept a beam of light around the room, my worst fears were realized. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure shrouded in shadows, their features obscured by the darkness. My heart skipped a beat as I realized that this was the intruder, the person who had entered the facility uninvited. I opened my mouth to shout for help, but no sound came out. Fear paralyzed me, rendering me speechless as the intruder stepped into the room, their movements slow and deliberate. I could feel the weight of their gaze upon me, cold and calculating as they sized me up with unnerving precision. I knew then that we were in grave danger, that this person was not here with good intentions. With a sinking feeling in the pit of my stomach, I realized that we were completely at the mercy of the intruder, with no way to defend ourselves against their unknown motives. But just as I was about to resign myself to our fate, I heard the sound of approaching footsteps, echoing down the hallway like a beacon of hope. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help was on the way, that we wouldn't have to face this threat alone. I turned to my colleagues, my voice trembling with emotion as I urged them to stay calm and wait for assistance to arrive. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, the intruder turned and fled into the darkness, disappearing into the shadows without a trace. We watched in stunned silence as they vanished from sight, our hearts still pounding in our chests as we struggled to make sense of what had just happened. The sea was rough that morning, the waves crashing against the sides of my fishing boat with a ferocity that sent shivers down my spine. The sky was pitch black, the only light coming from the faint glow of the stars overhead. I had been out on the water since before dawn, casting my nets in search of a good catch. But as the storm rolled in, bringing with it powerful winds and torrential rain, I knew that I was in for a rough ride. Despite the worsening weather, I was determined to make the most of my time on the water. Fishing was my livelihood, my way of providing for my family, and I couldn't afford to let a little bad weather get in the way. But as the storm grew fiercer and the waves grew higher, I began to second-guess my decision to stay out on the water. The wind howled around me, threatening to capsize my boat with every gust, and the rain lashed against my skin like 1,000 tiny needles. I knew that I needed to get back to shore, to safety, before it was too late. But the storm had other plans, tossing my boat around like a toy in the hands of a child. With each passing moment, the situation grew more dire. The waves grew larger, crashing over the sides of my boat and soaking me to the bone. I struggled to keep my vessel afloat, fighting against the powerful currents that threatened to pull me under. But just when I thought that all hope was lost, I saw a faint glimmer of light on the horizon, signaling the safety of land. With renewed determination, I steered my boat towards the shore, pushing through the storm with all the strength I could muster. As I drew closer to safety, I could feel the tension in my muscles easing, the adrenaline fading as the promise of salvation grew nearer. But just as I was about to reach the safety of the harbor, disaster struck. A massive wave crashed over the bow of my boat, sending me tumbling into the churning waters below. I struggled to stay afloat, gasping for air as the icy sea threatened to swallow me whole. But somehow, against all odds, I managed to claw my way back to the surface, fighting against the raging currents with every ounce of strength I had left. With one final burst of energy, I propelled myself towards the safety of the shore, reaching out for the outstretched hands of the people waiting on the docks. And then, just like that, it was over. I collapsed onto the solid ground, gasping for breath as the rain poured down around me. I had made it back safe, against all odds, but the memory of that harrowing journey would stay with me forever. The storm came out of nowhere, fierce and relentless, battering against the windows with a fury that made my heart race. I glanced nervously at my pregnant wife, her face pale and drawn with pain as she clutched her swollen belly. We had been preparing for this moment for months, eagerly awaiting the arrival of our first child. But now, as the wind howled outside and the lights flickered ominously, all our plans seemed to have been thrown into chaos. I tried to remain calm, to reassure my wife that everything would be okay, but deep down, I was filled with a sense of dread unlike anything I had ever felt before. We lived in a remote area, far from the nearest hospital, and with the storm raging outside, there was no way we could make it there in time. As the minutes stretched on into hours, my wife's contractions grew stronger and more frequent, each one accompanied by a gut-wrenching scream that echoed through the darkness. I felt helpless, unable to do anything to ease her pain or protect her from the looming threat of the storm. But I knew that I couldn't let fear paralyze me, not when my wife and unborn child's lives were on the line. So, I took a deep breath and sprang into action, gathering towels and blankets and anything else I thought we might need for the delivery. As the power flickered and died, plunging us into darkness, I guided my wife to the makeshift delivery room we had set up in the living room. The only source of light came from the flickering flames of the candles we had lit, casting eerie shadows on the walls. I tried to focus on the task at hand, to push aside the fear and uncertainty that threatened to overwhelm me. With shaking hands, I coached my wife through each contraction, offering words of encouragement and support as she labored to bring our child into the world. And then, finally, after what felt like an eternity, the moment we had been waiting for arrived. With one final push, our baby emerged into the world, a tiny bundle of joy and hope amidst the chaos and despair. I held my breath as I cut the umbilical cord, my hands trembling with emotion as I cradled our newborn son in my arms. Tears streamed down my face as I looked into his tiny face, overwhelmed with love and gratitude for this precious gift. But our moment of joy was short-lived, shattered by the sound of a loud crash from outside. I rushed to the window and looked out into the darkness, my heart sinking as I saw the devastation wrought by the storm. Trees lay uprooted, their branches torn and twisted by the wind. Debris littered the ground, scattered like confetti in the aftermath of a parade. And in the distance, I could see the faint glow of headlights as emergency vehicles raced through the night, their sirens wailing mournfully in the distance. I knew then that we were truly on our own, with no help or hope of rescue from the outside world. But I refused to let despair consume me, not when my wife and child's lives were at stake. With renewed determination, I turned back to my wife and newborn son, determined to do whatever it took to keep them safe. Together, we weathered the storm, clinging to each other for comfort and strength as we waited for the sun to rise and the nightmare to finally end. And when morning came and the storm finally subsided, we emerged from our makeshift shelter battered but unbroken, our family stronger than ever in the face of adversity. We had found a quaint bed and breakfast nestled in the countryside, promising peace and serenity amidst the rolling hills and lush greenery. As we drove up the long, winding driveway, the sky darkened ominously, and the first drops of rain splattered against the windshield. I felt a sense of unease creeping over me, but I brushed it off as just nerves from the impending storm. The bed and breakfast looked charming from the outside, with its cozy exterior and warm, inviting lights glowing in the windows. We parked the car and hurried inside, eager to escape the rain and settle into our room for the night. But as soon as we stepped through the door, I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something off about the place, something that I couldn't quite put my finger on. The air felt heavy and oppressive, and a sense of foreboding hung in the air like a thick fog. We were greeted by the owners, a middle-aged couple with forced smiles and steely eyes. They showed us to our room, a dimly lit space with creaky floorboards and musty curtains. As we unpacked our bags, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. I glanced out the window and saw the owners lingering in the hallway, their expressions unreadable as they whispered to each other in hushed tones. I tried to push aside my paranoia and focus on enjoying our time together, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger as the night wore on. The storm raged outside, the wind howling and the rain pounding against the roof like a relentless drumbeat. That's when we heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing down the hallway, slow and deliberate. My partner and I exchanged nervous glances, our hearts pounding in our chests as we strained to listen for any more sounds. But the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving us in an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I wanted to believe that it was just our imagination playing tricks on us, but deep down, I knew that something was terribly wrong. We tried to convince ourselves that we were just being paranoid, that there was a rational explanation for everything that was happening. But as the night wore on, the sense of dread only grew stronger, until it felt like a suffocating weight pressing down on us from all sides. Then, just as we were about to drift off to sleep, we heard a loud crash from downstairs, followed by the sound of shattering glass. My partner and I leapt out of bed, our hearts racing as we rushed to investigate. We found the owners in the kitchen, their faces pale and drawn as they stood over a broken window. They muttered something about a fallen tree limb, but their eyes darted nervously around the room, betraying their fear. I wanted to believe their explanation, to trust that everything was okay, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind told me otherwise. There was something about the way they looked at us, something sinister lurking behind their forced smiles and polite demeanor. As the storm raged on outside, my partner and I huddled together in our room, too afraid to sleep and too afraid to leave. We listened intently for any more sounds, but the night was eerily quiet, save for the occasional clap of thunder in the distance. Hours passed, and still, we heard nothing. It was as if the world outside had ceased to exist, leaving us alone in the darkness with our fears and suspicions. But just when we thought we were safe, we heard the sound of footsteps once again, this time coming from inside the house. My partner and I froze, our breath catching in our throats as we waited for whatever was out there to reveal itself. And then, suddenly, the door burst open, and the owners stood before us, their faces twisted in madness as they lunged towards us with outstretched hands. We screamed and fought back, our hearts pounding in our chests as we struggled to escape their grasp. But in a stroke of luck, my partner managed to break free from their grip. With adrenaline coursing through our veins, we dashed towards the nearest window, smashing it open with a nearby chair. Without looking back, we climbed through the shattered glass and tumbled onto the wet ground outside. The storm raged on around us, but we didn't care. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, desperate to put as much distance between us and that nightmare as possible. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, where we collapsed in exhaustion and called the police. They arrived soon after, their expressions grave as we told them about our harrowing ordeal. The authorities launched an investigation into the bed and breakfast and its owners, uncovering a string of disturbing revelations. It turned out that the couple had been luring unsuspecting travelers to their remote location for years, using them as pawns in their twisted games. We were lucky to have escaped with our lives, but the memories of that night would haunt us forever. We vowed never to speak of it again, to bury the trauma deep within our hearts and move on with our lives. But even now, years later, I can't stop the feeling of dread that washes over me whenever I think about that night. We were just a group of colleagues, sent on a team-building retreat to a remote cabin in the woods. The idea was to strengthen our bonds and improve teamwork, but little did we know, the night would take a terrifying turn. As we arrived at the cabin, the storm clouds loomed ominously overhead, threatening to unleash their fury at any moment. The wind howled through the trees, and the rain pounded against the roof with a relentless fury. Despite the storm, we tried to make the best of the situation. We gathered around the fireplace, swapping stories and sharing laughs over drinks. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was one person in particular who seemed to be acting strangely, a quiet, unassuming coworker who kept to themselves for most of the evening. At first, I brushed it off as just nerves or shyness, but as the night progressed, their behavior became more and more erratic. They would disappear for long stretches of time, only to reappear suddenly with a strange look in their eyes. And when they spoke, their words seemed to carry a hidden meaning, as if they were hinting at something sinister lurking beneath the surface. I tried to ignore my suspicions, to convince myself that I was just being paranoid. But deep down, I knew that something wasn't right, that there was more to this person than met the eye. As the night wore on, tensions began to rise among the group. Small disagreements turned into heated arguments, and tempers flared as the storm raged outside. And then, just as things were reaching a boiling point, we heard it, the sound of footsteps echoing through the cabin, slow and deliberate. We froze in place, our hearts pounding in our chests as we listened intently for any more sounds. But the footsteps stopped abruptly, leaving us in an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I exchanged nervous glances with my coworkers, my mind racing with fear and uncertainty. Then, without warning, the power went out, plunging the cabin into darkness. We scrambled for flashlights and candles, our hands trembling with fear as we tried to find our way in the blackness. But as we fumbled in the darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched, that someone or something was lurking in the shadows, waiting to strike. I urged my coworkers to stick together, to stay vigilant and watchful for any signs of danger. But as the hours passed and the storm raged on outside, I couldn't shake the feeling that our lives were in grave danger. And then, just when I thought things couldn't get any worse, we heard a blood-curdling scream pierce the silence of the night. We rushed to investigate, our hearts pounding in our chests as we followed the sound to its source. And that's when we found it, a gruesome scene unfolding before our eyes. Our coworker, the one who had been acting strangely all night, stood over another member of the group, a look of madness in their eyes as they brandished a knife. We sprang into action, overpowering the would-be attacker and restraining them until help arrived. But as we waited for the authorities to arrive, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much darker and more sinister. As the storm raged on outside, I realized that we were trapped in a nightmare of our own making. But then, just as despair threatened to overwhelm us, we heard the sound of approaching sirens. Relief flooded through me as I realized that help was finally on the way. Minutes later, the authorities arrived, their flashing lights cutting through the darkness like beacons of hope. They quickly assessed the situation, taking the would-be attacker into custody and ensuring that the rest of us were safe. As we emerged from the cabin, blinking in the harsh glare of the police lights, I felt a sense of overwhelming gratitude wash over me. We had survived the night, escaped the clutches of danger, and emerged stronger for it. In the days that followed, we pieced together the events of that fateful night, trying to make sense of the horror that had unfolded in our midst. It turned out that our coworker had been suffering from a severe mental illness, one that had gone unnoticed until it was too late. But despite the trauma we had endured, we refused to let it define us. We leaned on each other for support, drawing strength from our shared experience and vowing to never take our safety for granted again. And as we returned to our normal lives, I knew that the bonds we had forged in that remote cabin would never be broken. We had faced our darkest fears together and emerged victorious, stronger and more resilient than ever before. As for me, I couldn't shake the feeling that our brush with danger had changed me in ways I couldn't fully comprehend.